Mark 12:28 to 34. One of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating. Noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he asked him, "Of all the commands, which is the most important?" "The most important one," answered Jesus, "is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is the Lord is one. Lord, love the Lord with all or sorry. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these." "Well said, teacher." The man replied, "You are right in saying that God is one, and there is no other but him. To love him with all your heart, with all your understanding, and with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself is more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices." When Jesus saw that he had answered wisely and said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God," and from then no one dared ask any more questions.
This past winter, I was sitting in my living room reading a book and having a cup of tea, and I felt this draft behind me. So I looked behind me, expecting to see the window open, but it was closed. Thought that was odd. Go back to reading my book, and just moments later, I felt wind on my back. And so I turned around, windows closed. This happened 2 or 3 times. Here I am on top of my chair, inspecting the window to see if there's a new crack or something that's happened. But it finally came to the moment. These 50-year-old single-pane windows have lived their life, and they are now finished and do no benefit at all. And so we do what most people do. We call a few companies and get a couple of estimates. I've never really thought that much about windows before, and I did a little bit of research, asked AI a couple things, and thought I was prepared for these window companies to come in to give their estimates. But then they began to start asking me questions that I've never considered before and explaining why their product is superior to the competitors and giving me all these details. Have you thought about what color you want your windows? What trim? 3-pane or 2-pane? I didn't know there was so many kinds of panes of windows. Metal flanging, weather stripping, waterproofing, reflective coating. You can't forget about what rating is a reflective coating. Argon rating. Where is it manufactured? What is the vinyl material made of? This was all new for me. And this whole world with so many details that I was unsure about. I've never stepped into the window manufacturing world before, and I felt overwhelmed. I liken this experience to that of those who have recently started exploring Jesus. Church, the Bible, and Jesus is all new for you. Thus, there are many different pieces that you are wrestling with, many different details and questions that you are exploring. How can we trust the Bible? How do I make sense of who Adam and Eve's kids married? What about evolution? How does the Trinity even work? How do I know that this is just not simply in my head? And how can I explain all the church injustices that have happened in history? I sit down with people who are new, who are exploring faith, and they are often overwhelmed by all their questions and everything that they seem they need to know. When there is seemingly so much to know, so much to understand, this reality begs the question, what is most essential? Of all the things that I should know and do, what is most important? What's the whole point of this? This is precisely the question that Jesus addresses in this part of Mark's biography. And it is eerily familiar to what he has been saying all along throughout the entire biography. If you've been tracking with us for a while, if you've been part of the services the last few weeks, you might have noticed that the theme of each Sunday's teaching is somewhat similar. And this isn't the result of our teaching team thinking it's summer and they're sitting on the beach all week and they're calling it in and they're just using last week's and just freshening it up a little bit. This isn't a lack of creative talks that we're not putting in the effort, but this is the result of Jesus at a nauseating level saying the same thing over and over and over again. It's almost as if Jesus wants you to get it, to understand what the main point is, to not miss what's most essential, what's most important to living life. In leadership, we were told to repeat the vision so often that people get tired of hearing it. The leadership experts would tell you that it's only when they get tired of it is actually when they begin to hear and understand it fully. Human beings are forgetful. We lose track of the plot. We need what is most essential to be said to us many times. And so this is the reality that Jesus wants to make crystal clear to you and I. He is summarizing everything he has taught by bringing all the themes into one single command. So as we look at this all too familiar passage for those of you who have been in church for a while, we have to see how vital it is for us to look at this afresh. Because for some of us, our discipleship to Jesus has become cumbersome and complicated, and we've forgotten what's most essential. We need to be reminded that following Jesus in many ways is simple. So to do that, we are looking back in Mark's biography in chapter 12. So I invite you, if you have a Bible, to turn back there if it's still on your lap, verse 28 of chapter 12. And as you make your way there, we want to examine what matters most to Jesus. What's most important to him. What's most essential of following Jesus and living life. And as you look to that passage, let me just give you a little context of where you find yourself in the life of Jesus. If you remember from last week, Jesus has entered into Jerusalem. They laid down cloaks for him. They sang Hosanna. He's entering in his last week before his death. But after his entrance into Jerusalem, he goes and clears out all the money exchangers, which was outside the temple because of their hypocrisy. And then he says some pretty combative things to the religious elite. And these things he suggested were against the temple being destroyed, which was what was most sacred. It was the center of the religious life for the religious Jews. And because of all this reality, this group of individuals known as the Sanhedrin, which is comprised of a who's who of Judaism and religious power, they come to debate this rural rabbi. Remember, Jesus doesn't have any qualifications. He didn't go to the best rabbi schools. He's from Galilee. He's born in Nazareth. Who is this Jesus? So the best of the best, the supreme religious leaders, the best rabbis, the best thinkers, the best debaters, they come and they challenge Jesus to demonstrate he's not worthy of following. Their goal is to outsmart him. They asked all the big controversial questions of the day. What happens to us when we die? Do we have to pay taxes to Caesar? And after answering these questions sufficiently, we have this third group of the Sanhedrin known as the scribes. And one of these scribes comes up to Jesus and he says this, verse 28. One of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating. Noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he asked Jesus, of all the commandments, which is most important? This is a valid question. One that was often posed to rabbis just like Jesus. See, the Old Testament had 613 commandments. That's a lot of things to do, a lot of rules. And so to ask what is most essential, to summarize the whole Torah into a statement is not a bad question. And it's that question where Jesus then gives his perspective. Verse 29, the most important one, Jesus says, is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Jesus begins here by quoting Deuteronomy 6, which to any good Jew at that time, they would know this intrinsically. This was the Shema, which means in the Hebrew word is hear. This was the prayer that Jews would pray every morning and every evening. It was so foundational to how they thought about their faith and what life would be, is that they would write this prayer on small pieces of paper, roll them up into small little leather boxes and wear them around their foreheads because they didn't want to forget it. Every synagogue service started with this. Every doorframe of every Jewish house had it written on it. Needless to say, this was foundational to the Jewish belief system at the time. The Shema was the creed of Judaism. It expressed what was most essential to spiritual formation. And it was this: to love God expressed by living out the Torah. Every Jew knew that and understood that. Although described as for one statement, what was most important for one command, but Jesus gives two. He goes on, he then quotes Leviticus 19:18. He says this, verse 31. Second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There's no greater commandment than these. See, Jesus' first answer here, quoting the Shema, it made a lot of sense. It demonstrated his respect for the well-established creed of Judaism. Everybody was expecting that answer. He fell within the tradition of what Rabbi said before him and what Rabbi said after him. But what wasn't expected, what no one saw, is that he would add loving your neighbor to this command. He combines loving God with loving your neighbor. He interconnects the two, and he says they are one command in themselves. This is the first time any rabbi has put loving God and loving others expressed in one command. Of course, rabbis before and after would express both of them as sentiments of Judaism, that you should follow them. But never before has a rabbi put them together and says to understand how to love God and understand how to love others is interconnected with one another. This was completely revolutionary. It's taking the old established creed and making a new one. The New Testament scholar Scott McKnight speaks of how significant this was. He calls this the Jesus Creed. He says this, quote, "This is the Jesus Creed, and it is the foundation of everything Jesus teaches about spiritual formation. Jesus, too, knows what life is all about, and that life is about love for God and for others." So if this is so essential, if this is what's most important to Jesus, if this is what Jesus wants us to understand, if this is what Jesus says what life is all about, then we better understand what Jesus fully means here. Especially those of us who've heard this verse 1,000 times. So to do that, I have another diagram for you this week. So Jesus here illustrates that we need to love God and we need to love others, and they're interconnected. The vertical is connected to the horizontal. That how we love one another and how we love God, they are one and the same. But there's really three aspects that we need to understand when we think about Jesus, what's most essential to Jesus. The first aspect is this: receiving God's love. Jesus begins the command with saying, quoting the Shema, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God." That's the first thing that Jesus says. And Jesus names this with intention. However, how are we to love God? See, our love for God is based on God's love for us. Later, one of the writers picks up this idea in 1 John 4:19. He says it this way: we love because he first loved us. This is essential. This first aspect cannot be missed. Before we get to two loves, Jesus' command, loving God and loving others, we have to understand how this love is made possible. We learn to love God and love others by understanding how God loves us. This is the foundational piece which the whole command sits on. Rowan Williams says, all love begins in the debt of gratitude. We receive love to give love. So perhaps this would be a better diagram for how we can think about it. We receive the love of God, and by receiving the love of God, then we in that reality are able to give love to others and to God. So the very first aspect of understanding what Jesus says is essential of life is to understand that there is a life force, that there's a love available for us to receive. And it is the starting place. That the other aspects of Jesus' command will not make sense unless you first understand this. So we receive God's love, and secondly, he calls us to love God. And our love for God is a response. It's a response to the love that we've experienced. It's not a love out of duty or obligation, but to love God is a decision of freedom of will. Like any loving relationship, it is a response to the love you experience. It's getting caught up in the feeling of love, and worship is the response that we have. And that's why the old Shema qualifies this, that we are to love God with our whole selves. The word all in this verse is used 4 times. It conveys the idea that we are to love God with our whole being, or intellect, or emotions, or will. So our love for God is expressed through following Jesus and loving others. And of course, there is much I could say about loving God. But where I want us to spend the majority of our time is this third and final aspect about loving others, and how Jesus this revolutionary thing combined loving others with loving God. In other words, for Jesus, one of the primary ways that we love God is by loving others. So the third aspect, love of others. It's the receiving of God's love that allows us to love others. Jesus says this, love your neighbor as yourself. That was new. Love your neighbor was part of the Torah, but love your neighbor as yourself was a new concept. And Jesus says this because he assumes that the way we understand ourselves profoundly affects how we love others. The way you view yourself, the way you have an understanding of yourself is radical implications of how you love others. And the Christian answer to the worth isn't learning to manufacture love for ourselves. It's learning to see ourselves as God sees us, deeply loved by him. We can't love others if we have no love to give. If we have a low view of ourselves, our insecurity will create an inability not only to love others, but even to be aware of them. We will be so self-consumed in our lack. Why is this so crucial for us in understanding the order of loves? Why is it important that we understand how we are to receive love, to give love? Because it's the love we receive is that the love we give. The kind of love we receive is the kind of love that we give. We know this. Psychology has told us this. The kind of love you received as a child is the love that you end up giving in your adult years. We receive God's love, and it is this love that allows us to love God and to love others. If you ask individuals today where they experience love, many would give varying answers to that question, but most would say from another individual. And of course, you can experience meaningful, deep love from another person, but it will never fully allow you to love others fully. John Stott, the great New Testament scholar, points out the reason why. He says this, but all human love, even the highest and noblest and the best, is contaminated to some degree by the impurities of self-interest. As deep and as consistent as my love for my wife Amy has been, it is riddled with self-interest. My own proclivities get in the way. And I can't fully love her for just being her as best as I can because my love, sometimes subconscious, is caught up in my own self-interest. Human love is one of God's greatest gifts for humanity, but no other human being can carry the weight of being the ultimate source of worth and love in your life. The love from your Creator is that kind of love that can't be challenged or taken. It's why we call it unconditional. Our love is often conditional, but the love of the Father is not. And our sense of love must primarily be from our identity in Jesus. We discussed this last week when we talked about where love comes from other places. It can make us arrogant or insecure, but when we experience those, both make us unloving to others when we're both insecure and arrogant. But this kind of love in which Jesus speaks of shapes us in ways to allow us to love others. To experience the love of God is what allows us to love others. I know I'm saying the same thing over and over again. It's so essential that we often miss it. This past Sunday, we had church, and my friend Dave was here with us. Dave is from Abbotsford, church that Travis is from as well, and he's on vacation right now. And so when you're a pastor on vacation, you don't always go to the church that you pastor because then you don't get much of a vacation. And so he was off that Sunday, and he decided to come out to our church. And Dave and I have been good friends for the last few years. And we've worked hard of creating a friendship that's rooted in not love for finding things in the other, but rooted in love in our identity in Jesus. And I can't stress how important this is for pastors, because pastors are not always good at friendship. We, pastors, can be riddled with comparisons and pretenses, which makes us bad at being loving friends. But Dave and I have fostered and worked on this over the years. That this was actually the first time Dave has been here on a Sunday where he's not speaking. He's been here a couple times and spoken on Sundays, but this is the first time he's come and just sat and he's heard me communicate live for the first time. And after we go out for lunch and on the drive there, he just has so many kind words about you, about the experience, about my talk. See, for Dave, he doesn't need my talk to be bad for him to feel good about himself. Nor do I need Dave to tell me my talk was amazing to feel secure. See, I don't always live out of this reality, but for whatever reason this day I was. And as we were talking about the different aspects, and he was giving great kind words about my talk, I also felt secure that I was able to go and ask him the follow-up question, but would you have any feedback for me? Anything I could improve on? And he's a communicator, so he did. He had one thing, and it was actually really helpful. And it was fine because my worth is not based on my output. Do you see that when two individuals are formed and nurtured by the love of God, we can love one another rather than use one another? See, pride will use people for superiority, and insecurity will use people for affirmation. Both forms of feeling a lack of love or need of love will see individuals as transactional to fill the love that we're lacking. But when you experience the love of the Father, when you're caught up in this Trinitarian relationship, the Father, Son, and the Spirit, and you experience that love creates a foundation and a security for you that you can enter into having loving relationships with other individuals. So that being said, what is it about being formed and shaped by the love of God that should transform how we love others? Why does God's love transform the way that we love others? Well, we need to ask a deeper question. What does love require of you? What is the most loving thing I can do? See, this seems so foundational to Jesus that much of his ministry was devoted to giving texture and language to this reality. See, the creed of the day in Judaism was following the Torah. This was what was most essential. This is what most Jews thought was expected of them. However, you can follow the law without becoming a person of love. Jesus pushes the target to becoming a person of love. He consistently challenged doing what isn't just expected of you, but he asks the greater question, what does love require of you? It's a deeper, more significant question. He stretches our imaginations by extending what qualifies someone as a neighbor of the time. He puts loving people over tradition and custom. He asks us to walk an extra mile, to turn our other cheek, and to give up our cloak. And he calls all of these things as love to God. How we love God is how we love others. Jesus interconnected love for God with love towards others. For Jesus, the litmus test of whether you love God is how you love others. It was that clear for him. It didn't matter about your devotion. It didn't matter how well you followed the Torah, all the things you did, your Sunday attendance, whatever, you name it. The qualifier, the litmus test of whether you love God is based on whether you love others and how you love them. See, love for God without love for neighbor can become an abstract spirituality. Love for God without love for neighbor can become an abstract spirituality. Love for neighbor disconnected from God can become merely humanism. Humanitarian, thank you. Just that A wasn't there. Humanitarian. That was for the three of you that were sleeping. Jesus, he goes on. He refuses to separate the two, humanitarian and an abstract spirituality. He refuses to separate the two. Jesus correctly connects the two and says, we love others best when we love God. This perhaps is communicated most strikingly in the exchange that Jesus has in Matthew 25. Jesus in here is telling the story where he describes that he was hungry, he was naked and thirsty, and he says, you looked after me. He then asks the rhetorical question, but when did you see? When did we see you, Jesus? When did we see you hungry? When did we see you naked and thirsty? When did we do these things for you? In which he responds, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. This is a new idea that actually I think many of us still overlook. We miss the interconnection of these horizontal, the loving of others, and vertical relationships are. David Gushee, the scholar, says, for Christians, love is at the heart of living, of being human. In 1994, Mac McCarter returned to Shreveport, Louisiana. After working as a pastor in another town for 18 years, he came back to his hometown, and as he came back, he was saddened to see how the city was plagued by crime, drugs, shooting, and instability. And he was wondering, what could I do to change this reality? He was compelled by the simple command of Jesus, and he decided not to create a program, but to become a good neighbor. So on a Saturday morning, he decided to walk to one of the rougher parts of his city and to knock on some doors. McCarter was a well-dressed white man entering into a predominantly black neighborhood, and it was understandably met with some suspicion. But his message was remarkably simple. This is what he would say. Hi, I'm Mac McCarter, and there's a group of us that think if we can be friends, we can rebuild this city. That was his pitch. Initially, doors were closed or barely opened, so he came back the next Saturday, and the next, and the next. He kept showing up roughly at the same time every single Saturday. And the most incredible thing happened within about 3 months. People were waiting for him on their front porches, waiting for Mac to arrive. He gone from being a stranger to a friend. He became their neighbor. What started as a few turned into what is now known as Community Renewal International. And in Shreveport, a population of 300,000, 51,000 of those 300,000 have joined this faith-based organization with its main goal is simply becoming good neighbors. That's 1 in every 6 residents. In the parts of a city where they've rooted this model, where they've set out homes and to become good neighbors, and they've really ingrained this into the people, and they have people who have bought in, they've seen a 44% reduction in crime. Simply by people living out the philosophy of loving their neighbor. What is most essential? What is the whole point? Jesus doesn't want you to miss it. The point is not to have the answers to all your theological questions. What really matters is not how much you serve or attend church or how great your attendance is. What is most important is, are you becoming a person of love? That's the qualifier. Not simply doing loving things. There's a difference. Not simply doing loving things, but becoming a loving person. I'm going to invite the keys to return, and I want to end with this. The essence of following Jesus is love. It's the narrative he's been saying from the very beginning to now. And this love is about receiving the love of God and loving God in response and allowing that love to flow through us towards others. That is the reality of what Jesus says in this command. And the invitation for you is not to think about how well you're loving others, how well you're loving God. The invitation for you is to start at the very foundation of the whole thing, is to receive the love of the Father.